We are delighted to be here. Thank you for having us. As our brother mentioned, we have 5 kids. The Lord has blessed us with 7 grandchildren. I see in the bio there, I need to update. It says 6, so 7, and more coming. And that is, of course, a rich blessing and a heritage. But with an introduction like that, I mean, you hear words like professor, pastor, author. I don't even recognize that. I'm just like Jack, just like Randy and your other elders. I'm just a regular guy serving the Lord in a church, a faithful church that I'm honored to be a part of. But you hear words like that, and I know what happens to me when I'm attending a conference. I hear that, and I put that person in a separate category. I probably will tell you enough stories about parenting things you should not do that by the end of this conference you will say, A, he's not such a great guy. B, why did we bring him here? And we were talking last night as couples together in the McDonald's home just about, that you've heard of the Doctrine of Original Sin, meaning the sin of Adam and Eve. Our idea of the Doctrine of Original Sin is let us equip you this weekend to tell you things we did that you should not do and what the Scripture says you should do, and then you can go out and create your own original sin, but you don't have to make our mistakes over again. So we do come to you really humbled by opening the Scriptures again. And if what it required for you to grow in your parenting was that the speaker be the pinnacle of parenting, then we'd all be in trouble, because I really haven't met a parent who looks at themselves that way. Matter of fact, I would say for most of us, you'd probably say if you look up the word parenthood in a thesaurus looking for a synonym, the number one synonym for parenthood would be guilt. I think that's probably how all of us look. And I hope to equip you to not think of parenting that way, but to think of this: God only requires of you one thing, and that is faithfulness. And so when we've been unfaithful, we repent and we continue trying to serve the Lord and continue to be faithful. God doesn't require that, for you to have God's smile of approval on your parenting. Doesn't mean that your kids all grow up and love the Lord. That's not a guarantee for any of us. That's the longing of our heart. But all God requires of you and I is faithfulness. So you take the seed of the gospel in your hand and you perpetually sow it onto your kids' hearts. And then, as Jesus said in one of the shortest parables in the Gospel of Mark, the kingdom of God is like a sower who went out to sow seed. The farmer who goes out and he sows the seed, and then he goes to bed. For how it grows, he does not know. And then, of course, he gets up in the morning and he's in charge of weeding and watering. But only God by His Spirit can germinate the gospel seeds you and I sow. So if you're thinking, outcome-based parenting, I need a guarantee on the front end that if I do X, Y, and Z, then God is somehow obligated to give me saved kids who don't embarrass me in public and who are drug-free virgins, and therefore my life is better. There is no guarantee. So if you pick up a parenting book that promises you those kinds of results, that book just cannot possibly be faithful to the Scripture. So what we want to do is look at the Scriptures again and remind ourselves in these sessions, what does God require of me to be faithful in my parenting? And pray desperately that the Lord would germinate the seed of His Word, which only He can cause to grow. So if I kind of reminded you of that and that need for faithfulness, which means you and I have to have a robust faith in the gospel itself. You and I have to have a serious foundation that also recognizes my kids are lost, and no amount of even my persuasion can change that. So why is this so hard? Why are you motivated to come and spend a day talking about not just parenting, but parenting in this chapter? It's because this is the chapter of ministry that exposes our unbelief in a way that even raising toddlers and elementary kids did not. For several reasons. One is your children are growing into young adults, and all 5 of our kids, there was a day when there was this transition from sort of what I enjoyed about younger parenting, and that is kind of this hero worship, that I think my dad and my mom are amazing. But there was a day for each of them when I don't know what happened, but overnight they walked out of their room at some point, a different child, and suddenly were looking me up and down and going, "You are a seriously flawed human being." And I've always found that, painful and disappointing. And so these years are volatile, not just because of what's going on in them, but as they become young adults, seeing us with more accurate eyes, it exposes all kinds of things in us. And that's why I love the book that you've been given, Age of Opportunity. That's really not a book about teenagers. That's a book about you. It's a book about me. It's a book about understanding what the things that our young people are going through and experiencing as they mature into adults, what that's exposing about us and idolatries that we tend towards. So I think these years are difficult because of some of the vulnerabilities that you can kind of ignore in those elementary years, don't really get exposed. And now these are the years where the Lord's just beginning to show you some things about you and your heart. And so I think that's in part why it's difficult. I think, if you've been living for your parents, rather your children's approval, and suddenly, they're holding up a scorecard, -7 on a 1 to 10 scale, it exposes idolatries in us, things that we craved and didn't even know were there. So all kinds of vulnerabilities. If you tended to live for comfort, wow, these years are very uncomfortable. And so, they'll expose things in you. And so Danny and I were talking and reading through some things that our pastor, Jerry Ragg, has reminded us of over the years in his teaching on parenting, and how these years can cause you to go for a quick solution but neglect deeper conflict resolution because that process is just so uncomfortable. So that's part of the reason we're hungry to come back to the scriptures. And so if you're living for comfort, you're going to tend to squash things, manipulate things, try to navigate life for your comfort. Others of you would say, it's not so much comfort I want, I just want respect. And that's the last thing I'm getting from my kids now is respect. I tend to be getting, kind of a critique. Others of you, it's control of reputation. However it is at home, that must never be known anywhere else. And it'll make you reluctant to open up your life to others and to seek help from shepherds. So all of these things contribute to why is this such a challenging period of life. And then for others of you, you kind of parented with a formula in your mind. I would say this, before we had children, when we would go to Walmart and see a child melt down in a cart, we would assume, wow, really bad parenting. And that's never going to happen to us when we're parents. Well, the Lord certainly humbled us in that process. And the same thing kind of happens now. Then you're in if your kids are just entering the teen years. I had a list in my mind of behaviors my kids would never participate in. Now, you're never going to see that happening. And the Lord kind of humbles you again. So I had a list of things my kids would never do, would never, participate in. And so that same naive arrogance that makes you think that will never happen. And when I would see a kid that was wayward, I would think, once again, wow, bad parenting, had they been more faithful. So the Lord humbled us, particularly with our, as we journeyed with our firstborn, which, let's be honest, all firstborns are the guinea pigs, right? We were figuring this out. They don't seem to know. It's a good thing kids don't realize, you've never done this before. You don't know what you're doing. And it's like, that's true, but I'm glad you didn't figure that out till you were married and had your own kids. But so all of that coming together, we were just humbled by the experience of, I presumed on the grace of God. We had family devotions together regularly. We were in a faithful church. I read Shepherding a Child's Heart, and then I read Age of Opportunity. So I really thought we would avoid all this adolescent nonsense that bad parents go through. Because of my superior parenting in the younger years and the foundation I'd laid, we would just bypass and leap gloriously beyond all teenage struggles. That's definitely not what happened. And so, I would say the nature of our family is interesting. We have 2 children, and then we had a 9-year gap, and then the Lord blessed us with 3 more children. So we kind of had the opportunity, and people often ask, hey, you got to do it twice. I bet you were a lot better at parenting teens that second round. I wish. Some of those same idolatries were still there. Some of those same buttons, when they push them, still provoked me in some of the same ways. But if there are some things we did differently in round 2, I would say it was twofold. One was particularly for me, my wife was more faithfully prayerful for our children all along. But I would say in the second round of having the opportunity to raise young adults, I would say that I don't think Tandy felt as alone in her prayer for them, a burden for their conversion. I stopped presuming on the grace of God. I knew they wouldn't get saved because I was a pastor or even because I was a Christian, but I confess I just presumed because they'd been in a gospel-rich environment. I wasn't as burdened to pray for my first two because I just kind of thought it was formulaic, and if I do these things, you crank it out, and God's kind of obligated. And I mean, I'm not really, but in my mind, I just knew this is how it would turn out. And with the latter three, that was no longer a given. So the other thing I think that we saw differently with the younger three children was, while we recognize that we are given the biblical role of playing the gatekeeper and protector of the influences that came into our kids' lives, I would say that we really did align our thinking more with what the Bible says about the nature of the human heart. In this sense, we realize, of course, the big bad world out there is a threat to my children. And I do have to play gatekeeper and filter on those influences. But we definitely carried a more biblical burden for our kids' hearts with our younger three, and that was, you know what, I could take my kids and place them in a perfect spiritual biosphere and totally protect them and bubble them and insulate them from the world. But the biggest threat to my child would still remain in that biosphere, because the biggest threat to your children's life is them, is their hearts. What the Bible would call the cravings of their heart. That's the source of every sin. And it's, of course, the big bad world out there. But you know what? If your kid didn't have a sin nature, then your child, when the big bad world influenced it, that would hold no lure, no temptation, no draw, no siren song. But instead, because of their own vulnerabilities, until the Lord saves them and gives them a new nature, those things are very real. And so I would say, if there are things that we kind of were doing differently in this second round, it was a more prayerful, a shared prayerful burden for our kids' conversion, and a recognition that the biggest threat to my child's heart and life was their heart, and not just the world out there. So if that just gives you a little bit of acquaintanceship for us. So what we want to do is come back to the Scripture, so we aren't tempted to try to manipulate comfort or manipulate respect or manipulate an outcome or guarantee an outcome, all of which are, those are just worldly means. Those are the same things your unsaved neighbors are doing with their kids. And it is funny how we can be believers in a lot of areas and compartmentalize, but in the parenting, I'm either just going to mindlessly repeat whatever my parents did that wasn't anti-biblical, yeah, but was it actually helpful, or just imitating what comes natural in the world around us, instinctive to us. What we want to do is remind ourselves in these hours together today, come back to the Scriptures, align our thinking with God's thinking. And I'd like to spend our time in two ways. First, in this first session, just go back to the big picture, the reminder of Ephesians 6 in the handful of verses. What are the priorities for my kids? That's you and I overhearing God's job description for them, and that gives us the scope and sequence of the curriculum we are to be training our kids in. And then, of course, Paul gives specific instruction to the Ephesian church there about what a father's priorities are in his relationship with his children. So in this first session, we're just going to go back to the absolute fundamentals to make sure that we are parenting God's way with God's priorities in mind. Then in the two sessions, we'll have another session this morning, another one after lunch. I'd like to give you an appetizer, as it were, for Proverbs chapter 1 through 9, which I would like to demonstrate to you, I believe, is Solomon's handbook for parenting of the Old Testament. Those first 9 chapters of Proverbs are unique. They're different from Proverbs chapter 10 through 31. And we're going to look at, just try to distill the main principles from those 9 chapters. Obviously, can't preach all 9 chapters to you, but let me just give you the highlights and a fairly detailed handout for you to go back and I would suggest to you would make great Bible study for you and your children together. So I'll give you that handout, and that'd probably be good for, depending on how often you meet as a family, weeks and maybe even months together. And so do want to acquaint you with this special part of Scripture, and we'll spend session 2 and 3 doing that. So if you take your Bibles, please, and turn to Ephesians chapter 6. We'll look together at these fundamental words that make us a little less vulnerable to unbiblical, natural but not supernatural parenting tactics. So just read with me these familiar words. Ephesians 6, 1 through 4. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Fundamental biblical verses without any apology that from time to time you just have to go back to and recalibrate your heart, because you'll find that you have drifted again into what comes natural, which is usually not what's best for any of us. So what you see in the first 3 verses are instructions to children. We're overhearing God's command to them. And there you're given 2 priorities, you'll see in your notes there, 2 priorities for a child's relationship to their parents. Then in verse 4, similarly, instruction to fathers with 2 priorities for a father or mothers, a parent's priorities in their relationship with their children. So let's begin in verses 1 through 3 to remind ourselves what the Lord tells our children, because whatever He's telling them is our job description. That is our curriculum. This is what we are to be about. And sometimes you just need to be reminded, hey, this is God's standard, and I'm not out of step to require it and to address it when our young adults are living in less than God's standard. So he begins with priority number 1, obedient action in response to a parent's God-given authority. So here's the command, children, obey your parents in the Lord. Here's the reason for this is right. So that word obedience, it has the word we get the word acoustics from. It's a hearing word. So children obey. What does it mean for a child to obey? To listen with a view towards submission. And sometimes you just plain need to be reminded what is the standard. Because the kids will wear you down. And if they find out that you're not absolutely clear on what God requires of you, they find that, they'll take the narrow end of the wedge and jam that in there as soon as they realize you're not absolutely confident whether or not you can actually require me to listen with a view to being submissive. Now, in the younger years, that looks kind of different. That means training yourself in the toddler years to obedience is to not have to repeat yourself 12 times, but to actually have the nerve to believe that I need to train my child. They're not going to do it naturally, but I have the privilege of training my child to respond to me when I speak in a normal tone of voice the first time. And if you've read the prequel, if you will, to the book we gave you on Age of Opportunity called Shepherding a Child's Heart, Ted Tripp, the brother of Paul David Tripp, he defines obedience as, doing what you're asked to do without challenge, delay, or excuse. So without challenging my authority, my God-given authority, I have no innate authority. Teach your children that. I have a delegated authority. I have no innate authority in me. But you've been asked to submit and believe that God will mediate His will for your life through this fallible parent. And so calling you to, we added with our kids, to obeying what we've asked without challenge, delay, or excuse. And then with our first 2, we added with a happy heart, which is harder to come by. It's interesting when more time, more scripture study, we kind of got rid of that in the second round and said with a submissive heart. Because I don't think it would be fair to describe Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He is obeying the will of His Father without challenge, delay, or excuse. But to say he had a happy heart while he obeyed is probably not accurate. So we just said to the kids, with a submissive heart. In the teen years, this standard from God does not change. You still want to train your children to listen to you with the voice of submission. And of course, rather, listen to your voice with a heart towards submitting. Of course, we'll look in Proverbs 1 through 9 in our next session. You've entered the chapter of life, however, when your children have competing voices in their ears. competing sources of authority, competing ideologies, competing theologies, competing worldviews, and so there's more challenge in these young adult years to getting them to listen in that way. So what's the standard? Obedient action in response to a parent's God-given authority. That's the command. What's the motivation? Why? For this is right. Right in what sense? Right in the sight of God. You can see there in your notes in Colossians, a parallel passage, Paul adds a couple of things to the Colossians church. Children, obey your parents in all things. And whereas Ephesians gives the reason as for this is right, very similarly, Colossians 3:20 says, for this is well-pleasing in his sight. By the way, I think you should keep this in mind when you read, there's some parenting books out on the market that I think tend to distort the concept of grace. Of course, we want to give our children grace, the same kind of principled grace that the Lord so lavishes on us as maturing believers. But some of these books will overstate the case and say, my unsaved child can't do anything that pleases the Lord. And you may even be aware that some extremes on the extreme right who would just say, I never let my children pray because the Lord doesn't hear the voice of an unbeliever. I would never let a children's choir sing in church because they don't know the Lord. The Lord's not going to receive their praises. And I think that's a distortion. And this would be a verse that would say, well, in some sense, obviously not in a saving sense, your child complying with your authority does please the Lord. And you don't have to be embarrassed to say to your children, this pleases the Lord when you submit to mommy and daddy. In those younger years, this does not please the Lord. In these older teen years, you continue to want to point them out. One of the great challenges is, as irritating as toddler behavior can be, the kinds of sins that are being involved and displayed, and particularly verbal things that are spoken by young adults that you're raising in these teen years, it's so provoking and sometimes breathtakingly hurtful. And so this challenge of you and I leaping over the hurdle of the personal offense and demonstrating to our children, look, this doesn't please the Lord. What happens when you and I respond in fleshly, natural ways rather than supernatural ways to the challenges of teen years is that our children just simply learn this. Oh, I learned if you do that, it really makes Dad mad. And that's not a really powerful message. But instead, minimizing, yes, you're going to be personally offended, but in submission to the Spirit, on a search and rescue mission, glad for the opportunity you have to intervene in this young sinner's life, you're going to want to point out to them, forget whether what you do offends me, provokes me, saddens me, grieves me, scares me, all of which are very intense as they begin making kinds of decisions that are potentially life-altering, scarring, with massive consequences. And so it hits panic buttons on us, so you discover where I don't really trust the Lord here, and so I get offended or I get afraid. So you've got to jump over in your actual robust faith of the Lord so that you're not a hypocrite calling them to trust the Lord while you don't. And so you jump over that personal offense, which is extremely difficult, and keep pointing this out. This doesn't please the Lord. This places you in danger. That's the message you want them to hear when they are involved in sins that provoke you, frighten you, confuse you, terrify you, grieve you. And so you just want to be careful there. So that's how you begin to impress. With the little ones, you say, hey, this doesn't please the Lord. With the bigger ones, you say, I'm warning you, you're making decisions that don't please God. So obedience is quote unquote right in the sight of God. So that's priority one, obedient action in response to a parent's God-given authority. Those verses are written to the children, but by overhearing what God requires of the children, it emboldens us to hold a standard that says this is God's standard. The second priority in a child's relationship with their parents is not only obedient action, but also an honoring attitude in response to a parent's, here it is again, God-given authority. So honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise. Honoring is an invisible attitude in the heart that holds, so whether the scriptures call me to honor civil authority, to honor the elders in a church, or in this case, a child to honor the parents, What the Lord is saying is, I require of you in your heart that you hold that person who God has delegated some authority to them. Again, whether that's a king or a president, a governor, a mayor, a police officer, and again, an elder, a pastor in a local church. You hold their position in high regard because God put them there. And this is another thing you're going to want to remind even your teenage children, becoming young adults, is to say to them, God requires you to hold your imperfect parents' authority that God gave them in high regard. Maybe it would be helpful for both you and to explain to your children, what is authority? When a husband has authority or headship in a marriage, or a father and a mother have authority in a child's life, what we're saying is we have additional responsibility, not raw power. Oh, good, I've got authority. That means I get to tell everybody what to do. That's not the biblical concept. That's a Gentile idea of leadership. Authority here is being depicted as people who have, whether that's a husband in his relationship with the wife. So my relationship with my wife, when I hear that I am the head and have been given authority in our relationship, that just simply means this, not raw power to make decisions, but rather additional accountability and additional responsibility. So in our marriage, there's a level of accountability and a responsibility that Tandy is shielded from that I bear in God's design. In a very similar way, in the life of your children, you have additional responsibility, additional accountability that your children are for a time protected from. And you are right to call them to just say, God calls you to honor me, not because I have some deep craving to be honored by 16-year-olds. I'm not starving for 16-year-old affirmation. I'm not begging you to honor me because I like how that makes me feel. But I'm reminding you that God requires you to honor me. And the way you're speaking to me right now is not honorable and displeases the Lord. That's so much more important than saying the way you're speaking to me right now does not please me. And if we're not careful, you'll hear yourself roaring or withdrawing or returning evil for evil or giving the cold shoulder or distancing yourself from a painful child because they are not honoring you. Again, you and I having to get over the personal offense and the fears that are triggered by their behaviors. This brings us back to just saying, look, I want to tell them you're not honoring me, and that displeases the Lord. So honor your father and mother, the first commandment, with a promise. I think, by the way, what Paul means there is that it's a first level commandment. It's a priority commandment because it isn't technically the first commandment with a promise. And just like obeying had a reason, because this is right and pleases the Lord. Here, honor your father and mother. Here's the reason, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. This doesn't mean that if somebody dies in their teens years, it's guaranteed that they weren't honoring their parents. This is not a promise of longevity. But it doesn't mean childhood sickness and death is proof of sin. He's simply summarizing the rewards and benefits that, like the book of Proverbs would say, in general, here's the kind of life, here's the way life goes for those who align themselves with this kind of a relationship with their parents, obeying and honoring. So you hearing that God requires that of your children kind of regrounds your authority and the basis on which you stand to just say, I don't get to arbitrarily decide whether you still need to obey or you still honor. No, God has commanded you to do this, so I'm going to be the voice that reminds you when you're not. And primarily to focus them on, look, you need to fear the Lord in this matter. Forget whether I find it provoking or not. That's relatively unimportant. You need to be careful then to please the Lord. So that reminds you what the Lord requires of your children. Now, in verse 4, we have a different set of priorities, and that is the priorities for a parent's relationship with their child. If the child's two priorities are obedience, submission, and honor, then what are a parent's priorities? And they are two. So if you look at page 2 where there's that little graphic, here's the way in my mind I map out this passage, and might be helpful for you. as we're just reviewing the big picture of what God requires. 2 priorities for a parent's relationship with their children, Ephesians 6:4. Priority number 1, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. That's from Ephesians. The parallel in Colossians 3, fathers, do not exasperate your children so that they will not lose heart. Now, we'll unpack that in just a moment and talk about what it means to provoke and exasperate that we're being told to avoid. But that's priority 1. Priority 2, instead of being provoking, this is a positive priority, but in contrast, bring them up. Bring them up. Literally, feed them or nourish them. If you still have your Bible open there, look at Ephesians chapter 5. In instruction to the husband, it says in verse 28, husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. Whoever loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but here's this word, but nourishes it and cherishes it. In the same way, the husband's being told, hey, guys, if you get lost in the weeds and forget how to love your wife, then just think about all the ways you naturally love yourself. When you're hungry, you feed you. When you're thirsty, you get a drink. When you're tired, you get yourself rest. And that's this word for what does a husband naturally do for his own body? He nourishes it. Literally, he feeds it. He takes care of it. He protects it. Now, that same word is now being used in regards to parenting. Fathers, you are to nourish your children. Literally, feed them. Metaphorically, it's beyond feeding, and it's all that you would do to provide and to Calvin translates it, rear them tenderly and bring them to maturity. It has built into it the idea of a long-term project. And so priority 1, don't provoke, don't exasperate. Priority 2, bring them up, nourish them, feed them, rear them tenderly, bring them to maturity. And then under that second priority, what the apostle does is tell the Ephesians church, here are the 2 tools by which you nourish and feed your children. Number 1, you bring them up or feed them in the discipline of the Lord. Some of you will hear the word discipline and think correction. I would say correction is, if you imagined this discipline being a pie chart, then correction is a part of the pie chart, but not the sum total. The word for discipline just means training of all kinds, proactive training, reactive training, but it's not limited to just correction, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. The second tool, parents, that we're given to bring them to maturity, to feed them and nourish them tenderly, is not only in the discipline, the training of the Lord, but also in the instruction of the Lord. This is more a verbal idea. This is the word that's sometimes often translated admonishment. And again, the idea is literally to take truth from God's word that someone has forgotten or strayed from or maybe never knew at all. To take that instruction and literally place it into their mind. So these are the 2 tools. Don't provoke. Do tenderly bring them to maturity. And how do I do that? Through training of all different kinds and through verbal instruction as I place the truth of God into the mind of my child. And so at any age, these principles apply to toddlers and they apply to teens as well. For me, a graphic like this just helps me not get lost in the text. Priority 1, don't do something. Priority 2, do something. How am I going to do that? Here's 2 tools, the 2 things by which you do it. So what's the banner over all of it? Bring them up tenderly to maturity. So with that graphic in mind, look at page 3 on your handout. Let's just take each of these phrases now, these 2 priorities, and talk a little bit about each of them. Priority number 1, avoid sinful provocation and discouragement of your children. There it is again, if you, in your Bible, Ephesians 6:4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. Colossians again adding, do not exasperate your children so that they will not lose heart. The Lord gives this instruction to His people because He knew, fathers, that we would have a tendency to do both of these. You can basically mark it down. If the Bible tells you not to do something, what do you know about yourself? You have a tendency to do that thing. And if the Bible tells you don't do that thing, what do you know about yourself? I have a tendency to do that thing. So the Lord is now just with a divine CT scan exposing all of us and saying, certainly not limited to fathers, but addressed to fathers, there will be within us a particular temptation to being provoking to our children and exasperating and taking the wind out of their sails. Through what? Well, it could be through heavy-handed misunderstanding of what my delegated authority means. Delegated authority means you represent the authority who delegated it to you, and it means that in some ways, in the way we're responding to our children's sin, we are not reflecting the authority of the one who gave it to us. That would be provoking, discouraging, and take the wind out of their sails. So, misrepresenting God's authority. You may recall that when Moses was told the second time Israel needed water in the book of Numbers, and Moses was told this time not to strike the rock, but speak to the rock. And Moses in anger referred to the people, you bunch of rebels, and he took his staff and clearly in sinful anger, in a disobedience to God, smacked the rock twice, and God in his graciousness goes ahead and provides the needed water for his people. But then the Lord speaks to Moses and he says, not because you raised your voice, per se, not because you called the people a bunch of rebels, per se, but the Lord addresses Moses in this way, because you did not represent me or see me or show me or display me, you did not believe, you didn't display me as holy before the people, you will not go into the land. See, God saw beneath, so he had delegated authority from God, and basically he says this, because you distorted in that fleshly display of a natural reaction to the sin of Israel, you didn't represent me rightly. And Moses paid a sad and dear cost for that. And so, fathers, we have this tendency, like Moses, to misrepresent God in sinful anger, in a way that discourages our children. You can see in your notes, I just wrote down there, so if that's one of the ways that we provoke, there are two other ways here that we could provoke or exasperate our children. The idea of the biblical word is to goad them to perpetually resent you as a father because of your hypocrisy or your neglect. Now let's think about this for a minute. This could be confusing. Let's get out of the teen years, go back to the toddler years for a few minutes. If every time I said to a toddler, no, you may not push your water cup off the high chair tray. No, you can't throw food, or you can't use that voice inside the house. Or I'm taking a privilege away, I'm taking a toy away, or you need to stop playing, it's time to clean up, or it's time to take a nap. I provoked my kids to anger all the time. They were not happy when I had the nerve to cross their will. That's not what's being forbidden here. You understand that? Of course your children will be angry when you say no. Of course your children will, at some level, be angry when you train them against their will. So it's not saying never cross your child, clearly. It's a different kind of anger. It's this goading them into resenting you because of either hypocrisy in your life or neglect. By hypocrisy, what I mean is not failing in front of your children. You will be a sinful parent. As a matter of fact, you want to send a strong and clear message to your children. When it comes to sin, we are peers. When it comes to our relationship, you must always honor me. There'll always be a gap that God requires of you. You don't have to obey me all your life. By the way, on that little graphic, if I were going to add something to it, I think I would take an arrow from the left-hand side of the page and let this represent time and draw an arrow over here to the right-hand side of the page, meaning that over time you shift from less and less of this kind of discipline and training and more into the admonishment, the placing truth into the mind, the instruction of the Lord. So over time, there's always some of both, but over time, toddler years, you're going to spend a lot of time here in this training chapter, and you'll instruct them about the Lord. But in these teen years, most of our energy is here. Because, long term, what you're looking for, what I want and when the Lord has been gracious to give it to Tandy and I, it's a joy. We want continued influence in our children's lives. A 34-year-old, a 32-year-old with 3 kids each. I want influence in their life. I don't want to tell them what to do anymore. I don't want them to obey me. But the Lord requires them to continue to honor me, and I want to continue to have influence. And if Tandy and I are proof, if you live long enough, first of all, if you're in the thick of the parenting years, look, I'm proof you're going to survive. I mean, you're going to look like this, but you're going to survive. But to have kids come and seek our counsel, hey, can you help us with this? What are you seeing in our parenting? Do you see anything, or what should I do in this situation? That's a humbling honor that we cherish, because we know we demonstrated enough sin that we don't really deserve that, and that's gracious. When I had teenagers and would see parents our age with adult kids, I would just say to them, man, I want my kids to, wow, what'd you do? I want my kids to grow up to be like that. And they would say to me, hey, it's just the grace of God. And I used to think they were being humble. Now I realize, no, they actually mean it. It really is just the grace of God. And so we're not talking about don't make your kids angry by crossing their will. But we are talking about avoiding a kind of hypocrisy in this sense, that you say one thing and you live another. That kind of hypocrisy will provoke your children to resent you. Or you have one standard of behavior for yourself and require a different standard of behavior for them, a higher standard than you're willing to meet. Hypocrisy could also mean that when you sin, you don't acknowledge it and seek your children's forgiveness. That it's okay for your kids to see you moved and grieved by your own sin. So how are we going to obey this command as parents? If we are told not to provoke our children, then we want to avoid any spiritual gap and hypocrisy. You want to avoid hypocrisy not by being a perfect parent, but by saying to your kids, hey, when it comes to sin, we are peers. I am in the battle with you. I think that's one of my favorite things about the Age of Opportunity book you were given. For me, the takeaway advice from that book was looking, I don't think he uses this exact word, but looking for the common denominator between you and your child. There's a moment in the book where he said, I had taken my son out to shop for sneakers, and on a pastor's budget, I had bought him the most expensive, nicest sneakers that we could afford. And they weren't the sneakers that his son wanted, and son didn't complain, but they got the sneakers, went home. Said the next morning I'm walking by my son's room, and I see my son putting on his sneakers, and he looks kind of upset. And I said to him, hey, buddy, what's the matter? Then my son said to me, oh, nothing, Dad. He said, no, clearly something's wrong. What's up? You don't have to be afraid to tell me. He said, you're going to be upset. And he said, no, trust me. He said, okay, well, Dad, I'm going to be made fun of about these sneakers all day. And I just dread it. They're the wrong brand, and everybody's going to make fun of me. And so the author mentions in there, he said, for once I didn't say what I wanted to say was, those sneakers cost more than my first car. I didn't create the gap. Wow, I can't relate to you. You should be grateful. The normal lecture, he said, I would give. And instead, he said, I sat down beside my son and said, you know what, I can relate. No, you can't, Dad. You don't care about sneakers. Oh, you're right. It's not sneakers for you anymore. But if you think that this fear of man, which is what the Bible would call what we call peer pressure, craving people's approval, if you think that ends when you're 18 and graduate from high school, I've got news for you. He said, in men my age, it's how much money do you make? Well, what's your zip code? Do you have a trophy wife? What kind of car do you drive? He said, I still have to battle as an adult, these caring too much what people think and concerns about that. I can relate to you. I would say that is the most helpful thesis in that book we've given you. It'll help you identify your idolatries, the things that you crave that mess up and distort your parenting, that keep you away from this big picture. And then just and equip you with the tools to say, try to find the common denominator. Saying to your children, when I was your age, or I never spoke to my parents like that. I sadly had one of my kids said to me one time when I was telling them, I was kind of surprised by the way I was being treated. And again, I was focusing on my offense and not the offense it was to the Lord. Those conversations never go anywhere profitable. And when I got done telling my child how different I was from them, and I would never have done that or spoken this or didn't, my child, not necessarily respectfully, but the message I needed to hear was this: "Great, Dad, so we've established that you were a better teenager than I was. Next." Well, that is exactly what I had done. I'm better than you. And when I was your age, I did better than you. I behaved better than you. That's not going to make us friends. That's not going to win me influence. And I was sad to hear, but I kind of needed, that's exactly what I'm doing right now. I'm bragging about my behavior as a teenager. How is that going to help them? I'm making the delta between us bigger. What you want to do is avoid the hypocrisy of acting like you were wonder teenager. Would your parents agree that you were that great a teenager? Probably not. It's probably a lot I don't remember, when I probably acted just like the child's acting right now that I find so offensive. So find the common denominator that says this: I can relate to you. Here's my adult version of what you're doing right now. And here's the great thing. Then you have this opportunity of ministry. That's why he calls it age of opportunity, to say, can I show you the passages that have helped me? Or when I was your age, I faced similar temptations. Can I warn you of what it cost me when I gave in to them and show you the passages that helped me? If that doesn't make you want to read the book, I can't give you a better endorsement, because I think all of us feel like I need help there. So looking for the common denominator where you can say to your child in sin, forget how it's provoking me. You're in danger with God. He's not pleased, and I can relate. Now that takes some spiritual work on your part and mine, because there's a part of me going, I can't relate. I never behaved like that. Just open the scriptures and let it do its work, and I think you can probably find, there's some area in my life where in a similar way, I don't trust the Lord. I care too much what people think. I give way to sinful fear. I'm guilty of signing a creed that's orthodox, but in my functional life, I'm just not trusting the Lord right now. I don't actually believe in the sovereignty of God except on paper. And so you don't want to be guilty of that kind of hypocrisy. That will goad your children into resenting you. The second way we can provoke our children, exasperate them, take the wind out of their sails, is not only through hypocrisy, but also through neglect. So maybe you think of it this way. If the only time you really engage intensely with your child is in a moment of correction, you are creating a toxic environment that they're not going to want to look forward to spending time with you. I'm not saying don't correct them, but it can be neglect in this way. You're distracted, and look, the teen years means that you're aging, which there's a very good chance it also means your parents are aging, your financial responsibilities are increasing. For most of us as men, we're reaching kind of the nadir of our career, and a lot of things are happening there. Either we've hit the grass ceiling and realize, I never really am going to play in the Super Bowl. And so you're hitting what the world calls midlife crises, where you're just realizing I'm really not exceptional. I'm really not anybody special. Or you have had great success in your career, and that will distract you. So lots going on in a parent's life by the time their kids are becoming teenagers. They're experiencing aging and maturity. Their parents are experiencing aging and maturity. There's a lot of pressure in the career. There are financial pressures. Lots of excuses, men, that we could give to neglect our families. Sometimes I've had to be reminded sweetly by Tandy, just saying, you know what, sweetie, even when you're home, you're not home. We just mentally, you're distracted. Your head is somewhere else. These kids need you. Come back to us, please. So there are a lot of ways to neglect your kids, and it doesn't have to be overtime on the clock. You could be home and your brain be somewhere else. Or men, we just get lazy and we come home and you plug into media. You prioritize your hobbies. There are lots of ways that you could neglect this priority of pouring into your children, and it is exhausting. In these years, I often had to train my mind as I was driving home to just say, I haven't crossed the finish line when I cross the threshold. I'm not at the end of my day. I'm actually crossing the threshold into my other job, another responsibility, another role God has asked me to play, and I'm not off duty until I am asleep. And men, this idea that, of me time, and if you're going to faithfully pour yourself and disciple your children, hobbies and things like that, probably just, it isn't possible. There's only 24 hours in a day. Not saying you can't have one. Find a way to involve your kids in them or minimize them. It's just a sacrifice, men, a big chunk of our life that has to be prioritized in that way. So you can neglect them in that sense. And that will also provoke them and goad them. When I needed you, you weren't there. And if that's a legitimate accusation, then what do you do now? Well, you go back and you ask your kids forgiveness. I have neglected you. You ask your kids forgiveness. I have, in this area of my life, been hypocritical. And so this is critical. Don't provoke your children to anger. The Lord knew that this would be possible for us. J.C. Ryle, in his Duties for Parents, says the following: instruction, advice, and commands will profit little unless they're backed up by the patterns of your own life. Your children will never believe that you are in earnest and really wish them to obey you so long as your actions contradict your counsel. To give your children good instruction and a bad example is but beckoning them with the head to go to show them the way to the heaven, while you're taking them by the hand and leading them to the path of hell. Strong words. And you understand what he's saying, the power of example. When our lived out life before them is a disconnect with, what we say, then we really are in trouble. I've listed there for you 25 ways from Lou Priolo's helpful book to other ways you could provoke your children. Just look at page 4 and just briefly cover this. The second priority. If we are to avoid sinful anger, then what else should we do? Pursue the tender nurture of your children, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Metaphorically, to care for them, to develop them with painstaking care, to bring them maturity. And fathers, note, isn't it interesting in our culture, nurturing, nourishing, feeding, which has the idea of tenderness in it, in our culture, that's a feminine characteristic. And notice here, this is addressed to fathers. This does not mean, men, that we become women. This is still will be a man's version of tenderness, and it will look different from your wife and their mother. Nevertheless, if we have the idea that raising children in exactly the same way that you would coach a football team is going to be a mistake, and raising children in exactly the same way that you would operate in the military is going to be a mistake. There's a biblical value coming in here that says you're in this for the long haul, and there will be tenderness and patience because you recognize you're a sinner just like them. That's the secret to our tenderness. Instead of getting all offended, like, how in the world dare you? And if I had ever done that, my father would have X, Y, Z. That's not going to be helpful. So in that sense, we are to pursue the feeding and nourishing of our children. How we do that? 2 tools, discipline and instruction. I've already mentioned to you, discipline, training, all kinds of means. That includes instructions, rules, modeling, rewards. It's 2 kinds of training. Proactive training, I'm going to teach you how to tie your shoe. And then eventually, proactively, I'm going to train you how to drive a car. I'm going to teach you how to deal with your finances. I'm going to train you what to do with your school responsibilities. I'm going to train you in what the gospel requires of you, who Jesus Christ is, the importance of the power and the work of his cross work. So proactive teaching as well as then correction and chastisement. Often, by the way, the question is asked, when do you transition from spanking to other kinds of discipline? I would say for the most part, what seems instinctive with every parent I've talked to over the last decades has been about the time the child hits puberty is about the time when it begins to make sense to stop with corporal punishment and look for other means. I mean, think about it. What was the rod when they were little anyway? The rod is this artificial consequence of action. It's a sudden, short burst of pain meant to teach one lesson. Sin always leads to suffering. That's about as much as you can hope to get through to an 18-month-old who keeps wanting to stick a bobby pin in the electric outlet while he's crawling around the house. Yeah, I just want to teach you one lesson. Sin leads to pain. Sin leads to suffering. You disobeyed me, that leads to suffering. As your child is maturing and they're, can handle much more conceptual work, then the Lord has designed into adult life more, again, the rod is an artificial, unnatural consequence of action. The adult consequences of action, when you break the law, it costs you money. If you do certain kinds of things, you're going to end up in jail. If you handle your finances in a certain way, you're going to end up poor and hungry. And so you will continue chastisement, but your correction becomes more creative. I remember with one of our kids, them coming to me, and they had just transitioned out of spanking into other kinds of, deprivations. And so they were not allowed to go to some social event because of some sinful behavior. And they were pretty upset about it. And I remember them coming to me and said, could I have a spanking instead? And I said, no, but thank you for proving I found something more painful than a spanking. This brings me much happiness. So you're going to do this long-term nurturing, fathers and mothers, by discipline and training. And then secondly, as I already mentioned, by instruction. To verbally take God's truth and put it into their mind. You'll see there, you can look these up later, some tragic examples. Eli, of course, a neglectful priest with his sons Hophni and Phinehas. David, King David, for all his wonderful strengths in 1 King, is depicted as never crossing his children. And having a craving for their approval apparently kept him from fulfilling his role. Also want to give you some encouraging examples of those in the Scriptures and even here in your own midst of this local church who would be examples of diligence in training their children. Lois and Eunice, the mother and grandmother of Timothy. If you're here today and you're a single mom of teens, or spiritually you're a single mom, you're married to an unbeliever, or even moms, if you are, just realizing I'm the only one really giving my kids any spiritual input. Their father's a believer, but he just isn't really fulfilling his role. Timothy should just remain a great example to you of God's ability to bring godly men into a young man's life. And for Timothy, that was none less than the Apostle Paul. And so moms, don't panic if you're thinking, but there's no male godly influence. The Lord will raise up somebody in this church. And if you have to tap somebody on the shoulder even and say, could you help? Feel free, or go to the elders and say, who would you recommend if that discipleship's not already happening? I would say I stand before you as a man who, my mother was a believer, my older sister was a believer, and in the teenage years when I was beginning to wonder, is Christianity a girl's religion? The Lord brought a 6'5" former center from the University of Chicago into my life, the minister of music at my new church, and he was an impressive, example of masculinity and desperately loved Christ. And the Lord brought him into my life just at the time when I'm beginning to wonder, whoa, no, this is definitely a man's religion. That man poured into me. In many ways, I'm in the ministry because of that man. You think my mom didn't pray that man into my life? So moms, just know the Lord can provide. I want to encourage you there. Israel's told in Deuteronomy 6, when you talk everywhere you go, just talk about truth constantly with your children. Saturate the home with truth. Also talks about times of both talking and teaching, specific instruction. And so, men, we are to saturate our homes with gospel conversations. That may mean, guys, on our way home thinking, I'm not off duty. I'm still going to continue to serve the Lord when I cross this threshold. And what would be a good question about truth that I could bring up at the dinner table? That takes so little effort, men, and would be one of those ways that we could grow in just saturating truth. Guys, I would really commend to you the practice of getting some one-on-one time with each of your kids on a regular basis. When we moved to Jupiter 11 years ago, I started taking one child every Friday, and we would just go walk on the beach, which we can do 12 months a year. I'm so sorry to say that to you here, but I'm wearing a sweater today because I can. We're super excited when it gets below 60. So guys, you need to look for that opportunity. One-on-one time with your kids is irreplaceable. You could ask your kids two questions. This is what I used to ask. What can I pray for you about? That'll open up something. And then I would say, it's funny, some kids will not tell you. I would say, what could I improve on in my parenting? And some of my kids were more than happy to tell me. And then the temperament of some of my other kids would never tell me. They would protect me. And so I would just say, hey, what are some of the things I do in our parenting that you really appreciate that I could do more of? And everybody's all temperaments are willing to answer that. And what are some of the things I do in my parenting that maybe I could do less of? And even my tender protectors were willing to tell me, well, you could do less of this. Those kinds of things were helpful. Asaph in Psalm 78 just lays out an outline for what we should be teaching the next generation, how to avoid the unfaithfulness and unbelief of Israel, and how to exalt the works of God with our children. And then, of course, the Lord's brought godly elders into your church. I know that because that's what the Scripture says elders are to be. We are called to be examples, even in our home life. And so that's the big picture, just a reminder so that you have the convictions you need to hold a biblical standard in your parenting. So I went just a little bit over. I think that shortens our break. And brother will come up and we'll call an audible here on the times. And then Lord willing, we'll come back and we'll start looking at Proverbs chapter 1 through 9.